live. Prelude to the landing on planet Earth. I'm in chapter 4, entitled EXITS. This is about the intended journey through the Middle East. This is due to a channeling. 3 people are involved. This is the beginning, where they haven't started the journey yet. And I continue, which I think is the last reading of the EXITS chapter. Andrija spent the greater part of this day on the telephone and taped all the calls. The next one in sequence was from Phyllis. She said that she had been to Bobby's house and she had seen there, and what he had said convinced her that he had never had any intention of going to Italy, and that he had faked the Korean call. She had noticed a tape recorder beside his phone and accused him of using it to produce the mechanical sounding voice of the message. And, "My God, Andrija," she said, "when I faced him with that, his aura, the fear that came into it." They had a bitter argument. Bobby accused Phyllis in turn of lying to him and said he didn't believe any of them. Phyllis retaliated. "Don't do this to people's souls. If you don't want to work with us, just say so." He hadn't even packed for the trip, she said, so it was obvious that he'd never intended to go to Italy. Bobby denied that, but said anyway that he wasn't even sure that he could heal. And Phyllis said, "Don't give me that bullshit. You've proved it." Bobby phoned soon after Phyllis had hung up and told Andrija his side of the story. He said Phyllis was upset with him and accused him of faking some message, but he swore he didn't know anything about a message and that he had meant to go with them to Italy, and had in fact been driving to Orlando Airport to meet Phyllis as arranged when his car had broken down. Andrija was conciliatory and told Bobby that he personally believed that the Korean message was genuine, and that he was now waiting for the promised second message before deciding what to do next, and would let Bobby know when he received it. Bobby said that whatever happened, he must see Andrija soon to talk things over, and would come up to Ossining in the next few days. The next caller was John from London Airport. An Alitalia official had given him Andrija's message, relayed through Wills verbatim, including the reference to our friends in outer space. The official, it turned out, was the UFO buff, so the message of course intrigued him, and he had been very helpful in getting the call through to Ossining, particularly when he heard it was to Puharich, whose book on Yuri he had recently read. Andrija recounted the whole story again for John's benefit, adding that he believed that for the present they could all act on the assumption that the message was genuine, remain where they were and see if the promised further instructions came through that evening. John said that he would postpone his flight to Rome until the following morning, but would certainly go then, whatever happened, because he felt that Diana would need him. He checked into a hotel near the airport and phoned Andrija again to give him the number so that he could contact him immediately if there was a second message from Korean. There was. It came at 1 o'clock in the morning, New York time, and this time Andrija's equipment recorded it. After all that had happened and all that had been said, for Andrija had had another long heart-to-heart conversation with Bobby in the evening, it would have been an act of supreme duplicity and contempt on Bobby's part to have faked this second message. In later communications, Tom explained that Bobby hadn't faked it, but he had fallen into involuntary trance and his voice had been used by Korean. Presumably, his wife had seen what was happening and had recorded the message on instruction, that had also asked for it to be played over the phone to Andrija, which was done. For some reason, neither Bobby nor his wife had revealed this. Here's my transcription of it, directly from the tape. This is a message for Andrija. Thank you for stopping the trip. We feel at this time things among your group are unsettled. It appears that it has been left up to you to take the responsibility. We have asked in the past that the group rely on Phyllis's judgment. We feel at this time the group can no longer do this. We feel you are aware of the person, of the ego as you call it, which has become involved in the work. There would have been much damage to the group if this trip had been made under these conditions. We cannot answer your questions at this time. There is a lapse, a time gap in communications from us to you. We will explain this at another time. We would like to ask you, follow your impressions concerning Yuri. We should ask that possibly Bobby could speak with him, and you know Phyllis was against this. We feel the responsibility is yours as the director to use the knowledge that you possess to straighten these matters out. There will be more communications. We will not be able to explain completely tonight. We feel you must sort things out and decide. We do not fully understand all of your emotions. Therefore, we ask you to be the one. You must leave at this time. There were 3 statements in this message which were consistent with earlier communications. First, there was the repeated reference to Andrija as the director. Second, the statement, we have asked in the past that the group rely on Phyllis's judgment. And the third, we do not fully understand all of your emotions. The latter statement was one that had come into the communications very recently, and Bobby had had no contact with the group since he left London in May. And though the 2 former statements referred to communications of the earlier period when he had been closely involved, he had never, so far as anyone knew, had an opportunity to listen to the tapes. On the other hand, the anti-Phyllis attitude and the recommendation to arrange a meeting between Bobby and Yuri were consistent with Bobby's personal feelings and wishes at this time. It was a puzzle, but on the whole Andrija found the internal evidence for the authenticity of the message the more weighty, and he phoned John at his hotel in London to report what had happened, catching him just before he left to catch the flight to Rome. The message did not affect John's plans, and his flight arrived at Rome airport at 10 o'clock on the morning of the 22nd of August. That was about the time when the group were expected at Capalonia for the transatlantic flight that Andrija and the others should have been on had landed at 8 o'clock. There was no telephone at the Villa Ilario, so Diana had no idea of the dramatic events of the last 24 hours. She had kept assuring the dying Roberto that the Americans were coming. It was at just this time also, 10 o'clock, that he had fallen into a coma and his blood pressure had dropped sharply. Her last conscious contact with him, Diana recalls, was when she had held before his eyes one of his favorite pictures of the galaxies. He had nodded and smiled faintly as to say, yes, I am a part of all that. It's okay. John had recorded his recollections of the events of the next hours, and there is no need for me to attempt to embellish his account, which is poignant in its simplicity. So I drove from Rome to Capalona, arriving there about 12:30. My worst fears were confirmed when I saw from the bottom of the hill that Roberto's house was surrounded by cars, for I knew that this meant that he was either dead or dying. I drove to the house with some trepidation, and when I arrived, Diana came running out. She had been in Roberto's room, and somebody had told her there was a car coming, and she was absolutely mortified to find that I was on my own. She was incredulous and angry. She clung to me, saying, why? And I couldn't explain anything. She didn't hear a word I said anyway. After 2 or 3 minutes, she turned and ran back into the house, and I followed about 10 minutes later to find her sitting again by Roberto's bed, holding his hands. Around the room there were about 20 or 30 people, just watching this pathetic sight of Ascioli lying naked on his bed, obviously having great difficulty breathing, certainly not able to speak, and not conscious. The tragedy was made worse for Diana by the fact that since the previous day the people with Roberto, including a number of medical doctors who were very close to him, had all given up hope, which was why the family had all gathered. Diana was the only one who had maintained hope and faith that he would be healed. They had not exactly made fun of her faith, but certainly felt that it was American emotionalism. I spent an hour or so in the room. Diana completely ignored me and simply busied herself doing anything she could for Roberto, wetting his lips, squeezing a cotton of water into his open mouth, and she seemed quite oblivious to anyone else around. By 4 in the afternoon I couldn't stand it anymore. I went down to the Villa Lanusa and stayed there alone. Night drew on and I went to bed. I knew that when Diana didn't return that Roberto must still be alive. I fell asleep and was awakened at 7 o'clock in the morning by Diana banging on the door. I went down to let her in, and as she came in, she finally collapsed into tearful convulsions and told me he had died an hour and a half before. We then went upstairs and I held her for about 5 or 6 hours while she cried. Late in the afternoon she pulled herself together for long enough to go and buy a mass of flowers for his funeral. There was nothing more that she could really do for him. She came back to the house and spent most of the time for the next day and a half crying. There was nothing I could do to comfort her, and it just took her a very long time to come out of it. But the one thing that sticks most vividly in my mind is the pain and agony and disbelief on her face at that moment when I arrived at the Villa Ilario without Bobby, without Andrija, and without Phyllis. I think she felt betrayed by all of us, by me and by God. 2 days after Azurlich's death, while Diana was still grief-stricken and John was doing his best but feeling powerless to comfort her, Bobby went up to Ossining. He agreed at Andreja's request to be put into deep trance in order to serve as a channel for Korean, so that Andrija could ask for some explanation of the events of the last few days. We feel you are aware of what took place, Korean began, when contact was established. We have asked for this group to come together. You've done much in this direction. We feel at this time there is much disturbance among your group. You followed what we asked. The remaining ones of the group still are not sure. Each one brought his own personality into this. We would like to ask these things be settled. There has been much work done, much time spent. We ask it not be wasted. We ask things to be settled among the group as quickly as possible, so the work may continue. Andrija said he was certain personality conflict problems could be settled, and asked, how did this disturbance look to you from your side at the moment when we were about to embark for Italy? What did you see that we didn't see? There would have been a setback if this trip had been made, Korean answered. Things that are coming to light now would have come out in this trip. We do not feel this would have been the best way to settle these things. We thank you for handling what could have been a bad situation in the way you did. Many will learn in future from this group. This would have been starting things on the wrong foot. Andrija asked about Asitioli and whether it in fact would have been possible for them to prolong his life if they had gone to Italy. Korean answered, this man of whom you speak was aware of his death. This man played a very important part. There is much about him that you are not aware of at this time. We will not discuss this now. I would like to ask another question, Andrija said, with reference to your use of the telephone to reach me. Could you tell me how you do that process, and that it's Bobby's voice that I hear, even though it is your inflections and personality? To me it is a vastly mysterious process, and I would like to know a little more about it. Korean answered, first, we would like to say This is the voice of Korean. The voice you hear is traveling through this being. You are aware of the difference in the voice. We have tried to make arrangements for direct tape, as you have asked for the statement. Do you understand of what we speak? Oh, perfectly, Andrija said. Because part of the trouble was in the group we were unable to do so. We have tried more than once to make these communications. There is outside interference of sound and electrical that breaks the connections down. We will bring information that you may understand how your electrical systems are used. We feel, though this is not as important at this time as the work we have asked and the work you have done, there will be things that come only for your self-satisfaction. They will be of no importance concerning the healings and the other work. A fortnight before this session, before Bobby went up to Ossining, there had been a lot of talk in the communications about the management preparing a statement of purpose and a program and communicating it by means of direct imprinting on magnetic tape. The mention of the statement in the above-quoted Korean communication is interesting, for no reference had been made to it in the sessions in which Bobby participated in the period between the 13th and 16th of August, though there had been some mention of the problems of channeling energy for direct tape imprinting. It is of course possible that Andrija, Phyllis, or John mentioned the statement in conversation with Bobby, so the reference to it in the Korean communication does not prove Korean's independence of Bobby's conscious or unconscious mind, but as correspondences between the material channeled independently by Phyllis and by Bobby constitute one of the most convincing arguments for the probability that the communications as a whole emanate from a source independent of both of them. I think it is worth drawing the reader's attention to this mention of the statement by Korean. Later in this session, after discussing various other matters, Andrija returned to the subject of the cancelled trip, saying, John has asked me to ask you whether this was set up as a test of our sincerity and abilities, or whether it had been to do with the fact that Roberto's death was a certainty, and therefore it would have hurt our group to get involved at that late stage. It would have hurt you, as you say, Korean answered. Regardless of whether the trip had been made or had not been made, the timing of this man would not have changed. He existed more days than was intended in order to play a part, in order to help settle matters in this group. To this day, Diana finds this idea that Acidioli lived beyond his allotted span in order to precipitate a crisis and a learning experience for the group is difficult to accept, as she found his death difficult to accept at the time. But when she heard the tape of this communication months later, another statement of Korean impressed her deeply. It was, John is not yet aware of what his Diana has learned from this man. There will be much good that comes from this. A similar thing was said by Tom in a session that Diana participated in at Ossining about a month after Acidioli's death. As he worked with you here, he will work with you again, and you can then bear witness to us, because he was one of us. That was enigmatic, and it reminded her of another enigmatic statement made to her by Roberto not long before he died. He had told her, with extraordinary vigor and determination, "You will be helped." She could not help wondering whether there was any connection between the two statements, and whether the two enigmas might not cancel each other out. It is a memory of a longing, the myth of the marvelous stranger possessed of omnipotence and omniscience, who appears suddenly out of the blue and changes the world? Certainly there is in man a deeply rooted tendency to relinquish judgment and independence to such a being, to make a god of him, which suggests that the worldwide myth is the projection of a longing. One might imagine the Ossining communications a product of the mythopoeic imagination, but on closer acquaintance we find they don't conform to this pattern. The marvelous stranger is not omniscient or omnipotent. He insists, we are not your gods, and insists too that man has free will and must bear the burden of it, and that the meaning of service is not obedience but cooperation. The events of July and August certainly brought these points home to Andrija, John and Phyllis. They also brought the hobby horn story to a climax and, as it turned out, to a conclusion, at least so far as the work was concerned. But for the others there was much more yet to learn, and there were new and even more amazing perspectives to be opened up. Chapter 5 is Encounters with the Opposition, and I look forward to that.